All right. Welcome to another installment of AMOS. Today's class is about product management in agile methods and Scrum specifically. Let's see how this recording will go. It's my first time doing it. It's rather funny. Anyway, so we've been discussing the general agile methods process in the last few classes, and then Scrum in particular. And now we will be looking at the role of the product owner today. The product owner in Scrum does what's generally called product management. An important function in software product development, the product manager is responsible for making sure that a product, some software to be developed, matches the requirements and needs of a broad customer base, typically called a market. And in very simple terms, a product manager and then also a product owner in Scrum is responsible for what needs to be developed, and then also in what order, meaning what is more important than what else. So what are the priorities of different functionalities that a customer or a market might need? In Scrum, the product manager is called a product owner, and he or she is responsible for the different artifacts that we create in Scrum, the product vision, the glossary, the product backlog, etc. In addition to that, a software product owner in Scrum will also help track the team and the development. So here are the main process areas, if you will, each of which will be made more precise or more specific by a set of practices that product owners follow in those. Not quite part of Scrum proper is opportunity assessment, but certainly a part of Scrum is the product specification, typically in the form of a product backlog, doing some product planning beyond the basic time box or iteration in Scrum, the sprint, and of course tracking progress overall towards some longer-term goals. A product owner in Scrum, in terms of the magic triangle of software project management, cares about scope. What is it that needs to be developed, as well as time, not necessarily by when so much, but by what comes first, meaning priorities again. Technical quality is not so much a concern of the Scrum product owner, that's more with the software developers. So then, walking through the different process areas, we can look at the practices that a product owner has to perform. Again, not part of Scrum proper, but still important is for a product manager or product owner in Scrum is to understand the market. So not only in terms of any small scale features, but is there actually a market opportunity for the particular product under development? What's the overall business value? Why are we doing this? And so market research is perhaps the first task as you embark on a new product, quickly followed by, once you understand the market opportunity, by the product vision. That is then a Scrum practice. A product owner needs to articulate precisely and shortly the vision for the product under development. So here's the example application we're using, a Wahlzeit, election or choice time, and specifically the flowers application of Wahlzeit, where users of the website rank flower photos. So the vision for that web application is something like this: a single paragraph pointing out how Flowers is there for flower enthusiasts, where they can upload their photos and discuss their gardening efforts, etc. The way I view a product vision, it also needs to make sense for the product owners and the company, meaning in addition to the primary business value being delivered to some users, there also needs to be an understanding of how the developers or the company developing the product benefits. So in this case, there may be advertisements, or there may be some form of value extraction by the providers of the flowers product. That product vision is like the North Star, if you will, of a software development effort. It captures the essence. It should be really short, one paragraph, typically not longer, focused exclusively on the business value and not on any technical details. It needs to be, or it should be, inspiring, motivating. Why do we do that? It's certainly not a project in the sense that there's an end date. We are talking about a product, open-ended, hopefully will never die. And again, should be short. And by it should be your North Star, I meant it's your ultimate decision aid. If in doubt whether, say, some particular functionality is important to the project, you should be looking towards the product vision, and it should help you decide whether this feature is important and should be done, and also whether it's more important than some other functionality. So it's a decision aid, the ultimate arbiter. Should we do X or should we do Y? And in what order should we do X or Y? So moving on to the product specification, there are multiple components to it. Perhaps the most simple one is the glossary. Glossary is a poor man's approach to a domain model. In a glossary, you capture the key terms that users or customers of the product will use to talk about it, the key terms from the domain. Now, in terms of flowers, that would be flowers, flower types, the way you go about gardening, all these things. In a financial application, it might be interest rates, loans, what type of loans are there, what type of financial products, etc. Nothing technical, it's the application domain, it's the world of the user. And the key terms from that you capture in that glossary, which is basically a list of glossary entries, each of which defines a particular term from that domain. The purpose here is to give precise meaning to these terms so that you can look them up in that glossary and don't have endless debates over what is a loan, what is an interest rate, or what is a flower, what's a flower type versus what are gardening supplies, etc. It's human readable. It's meant for human communication, so it's not machine processable. And it should be short. So here's an example from flowers from the flower glossary. What's a photo rating? What's a photo? Do you have a policy of photo sharing, etc.? And as you can see, it's a crisp term definition. So the term itself with at max a paragraph of an explanation of that particular term. The glossary is a stand-in for a domain model. A domain model, if you had too much time or were technically capable and inclined, would be something like an object-oriented model, doing exactly the same thing as the glossary, but just expressing the terms, concepts, and the relationships more formally. Now, that's typically a lot of extra effort that may not always be needed, which is why we replace the complex object-oriented model that would usually be your domain model with a glossary. And the glossary links the product vision with the product backlog. The product vision is very short. The product backlog is ever-evolving list of requirements for the product under development. And within those requirements, you use terms from the domain because you're trying to capture and describe the business value. And you do that by using the terms from the glossary. That way, the glossary links the product vision with the product backlog. So quality criteria for glossaries are short and precise. A glossary should also contain synonyms, but not redundant explanations. So if you have a synonym, point to the original or the synonym, use that, and don't repeat any definition. Here's a simple quiz. What's wrong with these glossary entries. Think about it for a second, and maybe the TA might hold the slide here and moderate a short discussion, and then I'll come back with my explanation. All right, there we are, back again. So KPI stands for Key Performance Indicator, which is a type of performance management. So it's okay to explain what a shorthand KPI stands for. So it stands for Key Performance Indicator. I like it best, and I think it's best if you start any definition with a precise type-based explanation. So a Key Performance Indicator is a performance measurement of particular significance. It's considered key. So what does key mean? So what does performance measurement mean? Well, that might be a different glossary term. And then you have that base, it's a performance measurement, then you explain what's key about it. And so you might follow up, like done here, with elaboration on the key part and the use case, for example, to illustrate that. So actually, this isn't too bad. Visualization. Here, visualization means data or information visualization. That doesn't really say anything. You need to say a visualization is a visual presentation of certain data, and then what data that would be in this context. Again, notice the X is a something, Y, a pattern where we explain the terms and using some more generic term that we then elaborate on how that more generic term, the supertype, if you're a technical person, how that supertype by specialization becomes a subtype or a more precise term. JSON. JSON is a lightweight data interchange format. Well, I think what's wrong here is, why does this very technical term show up in a glossary? Well, it's got nothing to do here, unless the particular product being developed is specifically about JSON, say a JSON library. Please keep purely technical terms out of a glossary. Okay, so we have a product vision, we have a glossary that gives us the basics for the product, basic terms for product specification. So now we are looking at how to specify the product as a whole that we're going to develop. The basic practices of product specification are: 1, specify a feature, B, prioritize a set of features, and C, manage that feature as it goes through development, is put into development. And this is all the responsibility of the product owner working with other stakeholders, as you can see here. So looking at flowers again, here's our example product backlog. You can see any number of features here expressed as product backlog entries, where each line in the spreadsheet is a product backlog entry and then representing some sort of feature. We will talk about what product backlog entries can be in a few slides. So you can see in row 2, there is a category. So there is an item, a product backlog item, which reads, as a visitor, I'm presented with a random photo when I go to the website. So that's a key requirement, I guess, for the Flowers photo sharing application. It's got a short name, show next photo, meaning you click, and you get one more photo, yet another more photos. And so looking at this, you have the short name, a short description, some acceptance criteria, etc. And we will look at the details here. As you can see, it's a list. The product backlog is a list of individual requirements, here sorted by priority. Typically, the most highly prioritized requirements are at the top of the spreadsheet because they are the closest to being implemented in the next upcoming sprint. So summarizing, the product backlog is a prioritized list of product backlog items. That's what's in Scrum is the PRD, the product requirements document that you may know from our product management course. It really is focused on requirements. There's no task breakdown really, and it certainly is a living document. It keeps changing because product owners work with the product backlog. Because as functionality gets implemented, it is moved out of the product backlog into the sprint backlog, awaiting implementation, into the feature archive once it has been done. The focus of the product backlog and the product backlog entries is to be about business value. And as you look at the product backlog, it has various scopes or time horizons associated with it. The items, the product backlog entries at the top must be very well described because they are ready for implementation. And so the top few items that will be implemented over the next few sprints, they need to be really precise, really high quality, so that the team can pick it up and know what it's doing. Product backlog entries further down the road, meaning also further down the product backlog, maybe less precise. They are awaiting more refinement. But they are also not yet ready to be implemented. Even further down the product backlog, you may not even have precise requirements, product backlog entries any longer, but just placeholders for upcoming requirements, product backlog entries, or just placeholders for whole categories, themes and epics. We'll talk about that in a bit, that represent the whole feature sets. So the entries in that product backlog have all these fields, of which we saw a few. I think at a minimum there should be a short name, what category, type of product or functionality they describe, the actual description, some acceptance criteria, and the estimated size that the product owner or a software developer is assuming the feature, the product backlog entry upon implementation will have. Acceptance criteria have the purpose of giving the team an as precise as possible description by which to measure whether product backlog entry actually has been properly implemented. You don't quite know whether it was done well if you haven't discussed it. And ideally, you make that discussion explicit by having a set of acceptance criteria. As mentioned before, in Scrum, it's all about communication. So it's rarely ever precise and certainly is not human independent, but still writing up stuff helps communication. That's its purpose. Here's a very old school set of index cards on some sort of Gestell board, I guess, and you can see how a product, you can perhaps imagine how a product backlog is being simulated here by index cards. I think this has gone the way of the dodo bird, even though there may still be some folks using something like this. I'm being told that people like the physicalness, the tangibility of these cards, but basically all teams I've seen have moved on to some sort of Kanban board or other tool electronically, which we will also take a look at later. So these product backlog entries can be of different sorts. We are not particularly holy in the AMOS project in our course. Rather, we channel all kinds of work through the product backlog. The most important ones are, of course, requirements or features with a business value to a user and customer. So here's the IEEE definition of what that is. A feature is a distinguishing characteristic. So something about the software that has defining characteristic that makes precise what this is about. Features are just one term for a functionality. Another way of capturing, or one way of capturing such a feature is the user story, which I have taught you earlier, but we will revisit this in a few slides. There are really different types of product backlog entries. The first three here on the slide, theme, epic, and user story, are all business value focused from the user or customer or market perspective. The last two ones, bug report and refactoring, are, if you will, technical issues, and we also allow teams to channel them through the product backlog. So a theme, we will look at that in a bit, is an overall theme that is an important functionality area of the product. An epic is a large feature, so large that you can already see it consists of many smaller features that will be implemented later. So an epic needs breaking down into these smaller features. There is then the small feature that can be implemented within one sprint typically, and it's represented using a particular format, often in Scrum, called the user story. We will look at that format and some others in a bit. So then these are the three terms by which we describe or capture functionality. A bug report is just that, a problem report with the software where some functionality feature has been promised, but it's actually not working. You should capture all of your bug reports in your issue tracker, like GitHub Issues or Bugzilla or Jira. We use GitHub Issues. And you should then prioritize them, triage them, not in the bug tracker, but channel them through the product backlog. The reason for that is there's one place where all the work is and where it gets prioritized. The refactoring is a technical change to the system where no new functionality, no new behavior is being introduced, but the overall quality is improved. As you may know, the challenge of the refactorings is that product owners, CEOs, anyone focused on sales will say, don't do refactorings because there's nothing to gain, nothing to sell more to customers. But developers need refactorings in order to keep the code clean, to do housekeeping. And the main benefit of keeping code clean, having a well-factored, well-done software system is that you can more reliably estimate the size and ultimately the effort that will go into implementing new features. So without a clean code base, you will not be able to do good estimation. Estimation is a good important part of Scrum, and without a clean code base, any of your guesses as to estimations, planning poker, as to how long it will take you to implement a user story are moot, because you might run into a bug and another bug, and without refactorings, it will all be so bad that any of your estimations will just be way off, meaning you will not be able to pick up a consistent development speed, and without consistent development speed, you will not be able to plan a release nor deliver on a roadmap as promised to a customer. So then, to go over that again quickly, a theme is indeed an overall theme for a functionality area, here cast as a group of features. Well, an epic is smaller within a theme, still a very large feature that needs to be broken up into parts so that you can put them into a product backlog. Never should there be just a theme or an epic at the top of a product backlog, because this is nothing to work with during sprint planning. They are further down the product backlog, and they need to get detailed by the product owner as they come closer to being implemented in an upcoming sprint. So a feature then in Scrum is often represented, described as a user story. And the way we handle it is a user story is a description of a feature where the feature is so small that it can be implemented, or the assumption is that it can be implemented within an upcoming sprint, within a single sprint. This is a little bit of a deviation from textbook Scrum, which often says or allows features to be larger in size than what can be done within a sprint. And then developers handle such a large feature in such a way that in a follow-on step to sprint planning, they actually sit down and break down a large feature into tasks, technical tasks, not business value, but tasks from the perspective of how can a team of software developers implement a large feature. We don't do that because we have technical product owners in the AMOS project, and we want the features to be so small that there effectively has already taken place a breakdown to such small pieces that any developer can pick up any of these features and implement them within the upcoming sprint. So there is a mixture feature here, sometimes combines or has the pure business value focused feature qualities, but sometimes also has a task breakdown quality to it. Looking at flowers as an example again, here is the tell a friend feature, a viral marketing feature where a user can tell some other users by way of email that they found this website, flowers, and how much they like it. So that would be an example of a feature, perhaps large enough, not too large, that it fits into a single sprint. So the three practices of working with functionalities is exactly features is exactly that. You specify them, you prioritize them, you manage them as you go through planning and execution. It's quite important at this point of time to take a step back to understand the purpose of feature descriptions or specifications, as some say. The way I view it, it's quite important to understand the purpose of your product backlog entries, which is either, or in Scrum, it's for illustration and communication purposes, though in more traditional software development disciplines, it would be specifications. The difference is that an illustration is not a complete, unambiguous description of some feature, though of course you should certainly try to be as ambiguous and precise as possible, while a specification tries to be human independent, precise, and complete. So the illustration serves communication purposes, is naturally incomplete, and we will see a couple of ways for how you illustrate some functionality. Such illustration will be used by developers, product owner and developers, to discuss what the work is that's asked of them and build up a shared understanding in the minds of the involved developers. So the purpose is to trigger that intellectual process of understanding what's needed. It's not assumed that any such illustration in a product backlog or sprint backlog will be human independent. To the contrary, a specification tries to be human independent, and it's left over, if you will, or a key part of contracting. If you write a contract, if you sign a contract with a customer, you will always try to be as precise as possible, unambiguous, so that you don't end up with a lawsuit at your hand because there's disagreement over what the functionality that was required or requested of the development team actually was about. For that, we have regular prose, but as precise and unambiguous prose, and the UML use cases as an illustration mechanism. Looking here now at illustrations, we are looking at a simple user story. A simple user story, in my words, is a user story that follows this pattern. As a user, for example, as a visitor to the website, I need a function, for example, the tell a friend feature, telling someone about this website so that I get some business value. For example, the value of sharing my love for flowers with my friends. And it's a very simple pattern, and it's not a specification, it's really an illustration. Illustration are often examples rather than full-fledged models. So they don't cover really all the bases, all the variants, all the aspects of what's going to be done, but that is to emerge in the brains of the involved people. So it's a conversation starter. It's a discussion starter as part of sprint planning. And it's certainly unsuitable for contracts. User stories don't have to be short or simple. They can be more complex, more like actually telling a story. And so you could describe the required functionality like this, telling a story. And don't forget your acceptance criteria, where you check up on various aspects orthogonal to how you told the story that allow a product owner and a software developer to use them as tests, or as acceptance tests, if you will, to look at some implementation to determine whether it was done properly. Certainly not going to be complete, but should focus on key essentials of was this done right, and the rest will again be in discussions. So again, this type of user story is also about starting discussions. Another form of capturing requirements is simply following different language templates. Here's a ubiquitous template, most vividly, most importantly used by a Nuremberg company, which is making a living of supporting this type of specification. It's a phrase where you go from this system must be able to let me print a document on the local network, as an example, and you clearly, following this pattern, sentence pattern, have the actors, the artifacts, and the relationships by way of keywords, established keywords like must, should, could, and these have defined semantics. So for example, must means this requirement is a must requirement. Without it, the system will be incomplete. Should means it's important, but if you have to triage, you may drop it off. And could is, well, you could have it, would be nice, but can be left off. Basically, three categories of implementation. 3 categories of prioritization. Yeah, so here's an example. The flowers must allow the user to send an email to a friend about the photo they are looking at. It's descriptive. There's a certain amount of interpretation possible. You can use it in contracts. That's actually a main use, though I think if all you do is using this sentence, then your contract may still be not that precise. Anyway, so prose is, of course, the most ubiquitous way of specifying requirements, and it's very versatile, but it also has no particular format. There are various forms of how to impose format on prose. Sentence template or user stories, if you will, are actually some variant of it. And there's better language, so there's language that's better or worse in precise use of prose. So that's the versatility of this is why you still have a lot of prose in use in industry. It's actually, I think, the dominant paradigm of specifying requirements yet. But it's open to interpretation, probably actually like most requirements. Use cases, finally, are some sort of formal specification, as formal as UML gets, which is not a lot, but better than nothing. And it's a structured format of capturing what needs to be said about a requirement, giving it a name, giving it a description, being precise about who the actors are, etc., etc. And we don't really use use cases here. They can be more elaborate. The strength of use cases is that they're supported well by industry tools and that they can be integrated into large-scale models based on UML that have traceability and integration with further activities, downstream activities in software engineering, like coding and testing. All right, so as you look at a product backlog entry, you have the item description section where you describe what it is about. And independently of that, you have your acceptance criteria. And acceptance criteria should be orthogonal. They should not be repeating the item description, but they should be testable criteria which you run as a check against the possible implementation of the requirement, so that they aid the product owner and software developers in making a sign-off decision. Was this requirement properly implemented or not? That's the purpose of acceptance criteria. And not just one, but typically several for each product backlog entry if you want to have a good, well-described product backlog entry. In addition to the core description and a short name, a core description and acceptance criteria, well, in a product backlog entry, as you use it to go into sprint planning, you also need to have an early estimation of the size. Now, the size is the measure of the size complexity of the feature as it is awaiting implementation. There are two ways, two situations where 2 points in time where size is estimated. One is in preparation of the sprint planning meeting by the product owners and some software developer who's helping the product owner or the owners. And so that they know they have enough features in the product backlog so that they don't run out of features to implement during the sprint planning session. And of course, then features are estimated in terms of the size during the sprint planning meeting, which is where the team as a whole does the more precise or the best possible estimation of the size of a feature. So how do we measure the size of a feature? Well, Scrum lets you choose many different ways. You can actually go by the ubiquitous person hours, person days, person month, which would be a measure of effort. But effort is somewhat dependent on the person who's doing it. A better software developer will be faster, will have less effort to implement a feature than a less experienced software developer. In order to, and then the estimates of different features next to each other are really hard to be performed as a team effort. In order to get the precision up of estimations, Scrum uses an oracle method, meaning the team acts as the decision maker, crowd intelligence, if you will. So not just a single person, and hence you need to have something where the team, independent of the individual experiences and capabilities and speeds of the developers, can agree on something, and this can then not be effort because that's person dependent. There has to be something like complexity or size of the feature. And that is measured in story points. So story points are a unit-less measure of size or complexity, starting with 0, no effort at all the way to infinite, not implementable at all. Here you can see the usual range of 0 to 13, where 13 here already means too large for a particular sprint. And as you can see, this is not linear because it's really more a category breakdown for a feature. So you have a way of saying it's small or medium or large size, complexity, functionality. Now, story points are typically rather confusing at first because what is that? No unit, so no time like person hours, nothing associated with it, not even source lines of code perhaps. What is size or complexity here? Well, the point is exactly that it's arbitrary, but only arbitrary in the beginning of a team-based software development effort, because the way story points are used is to start out arbitrary, but then become repeatable. So in the first few planning sessions where a team forms, the software developers will be estimating size and it's arbitrary where they define a medium effort in terms of size. But over time, in future planning sessions, they will return to that same size and call it a medium effort. So this way, while it doesn't matter what medium really means, similar sizes, similar complexities of features will land in the same category, represented by story points. And this way, estimations become predictable because the same size of story point, the same size of a feature will always give the same points. And we will quickly see something called development speed, where we sum up these sizes to get an idea of how much work we can get done in terms of complexity of software code within one sprint, one iteration of the project. So this needs to be experienced as part of planning poker, and after a couple of sessions, the team will be able to agree on some feature as a medium or large or small effort and reliably, repeatedly do that over time. A medium effort, two different efforts of their medium efforts will always be medium efforts after an effective planning poker session to determine what the size is, which is a medium size. So here you can see that discussion again. Size is a measure of complexity. It's arbitrary here, but the key is it's a consensus-based process that will give us the size, and the size itself is not dependent on particular people, while effort as a measure of time in some form or shade will always be dependent on a particular person. Going back then to what makes up good product backlog entries, or at least features, functionalities, we have the so-called invest criteria as a set of 6 criteria to measure the quality of your product backlogs entries with. It's a quite nice shorthand where I stands for independent, meaning you're trying to make the features as orthogonal as possible. So don't have a feature combine user registration with login with profile picture upload. Break them down into clearly independent orthogonal parts. Make a feature negotiable. Don't try to pretend it's completely cast in stone, because you can rewrite, re-ram features typically, and this is something that should be up for negotiation for all kinds of reasons. So don't make them cast in stone. Valuable features should obviously be valuable, have business value. Without creating business value, there's no point to having your project or your product being developed. The feature needs to be estimatable, because if you can't estimate it, you can't run it through planning poker, you don't know how much work you could possibly get done in an upcoming sprint, and you get no planning, you get no release planning, you cannot make any predictions whatsoever, any promises to clients. A feature should be small so that you can fit it into one iteration, one sprint. At least that's how we handle it here. And of course, by way of success or acceptance criteria, any feature should be testable. Don't say something like, I need to learn Java, and because you will never know how that would be a good feature, because it's not. It's a really bad idea to put this into the product backlog, and only try to put there testable functionality. So here's an example. What's wrong with this user story about user registration? Looks nice, doesn't it? When trying to upload a profile photo, an unregistered user is asked to register, log in, blah, blah, blah. Okay, I actually gave that away, so no need to take a pause. What's wrong here is it's not independent. It contains way too many different parts that should be separated out into different features. What's wrong with this one? Spam-free registration email. After user registration, an email is sent, blah, blah, blah. The email goes directly into the inbox of the user, passing the spam filter. And lots of acceptance criteria. What's wrong with this? Teaching assistant, please take over. All right, I think you took over and had a good discussion. What's wrong here is, in my opinion, predictions that the system can't make. The email goes directly into the inbox. Okay, that's the intention. You cannot make a guarantee. Also, looking at the acceptance criteria, that's way too exhaustive. Don't try to be that prescriptive, over the top. Product backlog entry, a user story, and its acceptance criteria is there to start a discussion, to allow developers together with product owners develop a mental picture of what it is they're going to do, and that's it. Don't try to turn things into a complete specification. All right, and this one I gave away too. Learn Java, learn Docker is really not a good feature. You might use this in the beginning of the course as you're trying to wrap your head around doing all of these different tasks and following all of these practices we teach you. But over time, keep completely untestable criteria out of untestable features, which are not really immediately business value adding or technology value adding. Keep them out of the product backlog. Here then again is the product backlog, and you see singled out the rate the photo and proceed product backlog entry using a simple user story, some acceptance criteria, etc. We just covered what it is that needs to be implemented and that users want. And now we need to talk a little bit about in what order should it be done. What is more important than something else? So prioritization of product backlog entries. There are many different ways of looking at prioritization, many different models. Usually you do have a good intuition. Sometimes in addition to these are completely independent features and I need to see what's the higher business value. There will be other topics. So let me take a look at the very basic value and risk model here. You should put highest into your product backlog. The most highly prioritized items should be those of high business value. That seems obvious, but also of highest risk. And you should put second those of high business value and low risk. Why not the other way around? Why not do low risk items first? After all, you feel comfortable, confident that you'll get it done, and do the high risk items later. All right, interlude, TA, take over. Well, so it's very much human nature to take care of things first that are easy to do. But it's exactly the wrong thing to do from a risk management perspective. Pick up the high risk item, high value, high risk items first, because you don't want to be caught with high value items late in the project because you postponed them because of high risk. If there's a risk, address them early on so that as you learn whether the risk is real, whether you have to take measure against the risks. That's why you pull high value, high risk first and put high value, low risk second. With this very basic model, business value, high business value first, that's what you take care of. And then if you actually have time left, low business value features you can do, but only if they are low risk. Why waste time on high risk, low value items? No, you do pick up if you have spare time, if you have not so much time pressure, you pick those up with some value, not a lot, and low risk, meaning you know you'll get them done. Just ignore, never do high risk, low value items. So this very basic two axis, two-dimensional model is of course very simple, but it is focused on business value as the primary mechanism of choice. High business value first. There are actually other constraints that come into play as you try to prioritize your backlog items. Most obviously, dependencies. Some functionalities are simply come before others. So you cannot implement B if you haven't done A yet. That's one thing. And a couple of others. Let's look at those in a few slides. Here's a ubiquitous model, which I'm explaining for reasons of completeness, I guess because everyone does it, so you should at least have heard about it. It's called the Kano model. And it's about how users relate to features. So if you will, it's from a sales perspective, what the business value is of some feature. There are those which are hygienic, meaning must have. The product will not be considered at all if you don't do the basic things. There's a second category of features, which are features that are not must-have features, so you can deliver without them, but which are nice to have, which are good to have. So the more you have of them, the better your product will be perceived. But it's not really going to sell your product that much better. What is going to sell your product much better, if you have covered all the bases with the must-have features, are the so-called exciters and delighters. Exciters and delighters are features where the audience goes, ooh, ah, we really are happy to see that. We've never seen that before. So it's the innovation and the product that excites your users. And of these three categories in a successful product, you basically need to have all the must-have features. So if you are not really feature complete on that, you will have a hard time to sell. But you also absolutely need to make sure you have some excitement, some delighters in there, not just linear functionality. That's important. Something to delight the audience. That's the message of the Kano model. Think about your functionality in these three categories and make sure that you have all three of them covered, not just one of them. Similarly to that, there's the very traditional classification into high, medium, and low, with the associated semantics of must-have or essential, conditional, or can be dropped off. In Scrum, we don't really use that because we strictly prioritize, and anything that's optional is probably going to linger way down the product backlog and is probably never going to be implemented at all. Well, here's another quiz, pop quiz. How to prioritize these 4 features. A login functionality to some web service or web application, the logout functionality, locking out a user if there's a security concern, and the tell a friend feature. All right, TA, take over. 1, 2, 3. Ding. Great. TA, I trust you took over. So the answer to this is to look at it from a dependency perspective. Logout is obviously only possible if you had a login feature. So 2 comes after 1. Similar, 3 and 4 are dependent on the user having registered, not mentioned here, and having logged in. Actually, tell a friend may not require the user to be logged in, so it could be independent. Certainly 2 and 3 require a login feature. Then, looking at business value, login is important, logout may be less important. Maybe you just drop off the user. Tell a friend may be important depending on the stage of your application. Are you trying to market? Are you trying to reach as many users as possible? Then a viral marketing feature may have high business value that, say, trumps logout. Lockout, meaning a security concern, a user who may be a fraudulent user, Well, this also depends on the situation. Do you have 1 million users? Then you need to care about security. Do you have no users because you haven't started your service yet? Then this is a completely irrelevant functionality. So in the early days of Flowers, I would order this 1, 4, 2, and 3, which is actually an old story from AMOS. I had to stop an AMOS team once from spending weeks on security for the web application they were building. Security for a web application where there was no user. What's the point? There's no business value at that time for making the website really secure if there's no user. And on we go. There's another thing that textbooks will mention, the so-called relative weighting, another way of more formally getting to prioritizing elements where you take into account the relative benefit and penalty that how a customer would look at the feature, as well as the technical complexity and cost and risk associated with it. It's the Uyghurs' practice of relative weighting. Has a nice formula with it and is supported by some tools. It will lead you to prioritize using this mechanism a set of features. It doesn't really scale. It certainly doesn't work for an open-ended product backlog. You can only apply it to, say, the top 10 items of a product backlog, ignoring the rest. Then you could possibly use it. We don't really use it in the AMOS projects, which is why I am skipping this here and move on to the last part. So as you know, we have a process. In the product backlog, the product owner puts all the features. In the sprint backlog, we know what's under development in the current sprint. And then there's the feature archive, which we introduced. I don't think it's part of Scrum proper. It's simply the record of the functionality that has already been implemented. So into the feature archive go all those features that were signed off on during a sprint review and are considered fully implemented. Sure, there may be bug reports and they may need fixing because the feature wasn't that completely implemented, but at least the assumption is they have been implemented properly. And so we move them into the feature archive, thereby turning the feature archive into a complete specification of the functionality of the current product. At any given point of time, for the product under development, you know what the functionality is that it's supposed to provide. So it's a very nice way of actually not that concise description or specification of the product being developed. The way we handle it in the AMOS project is really just it's this long list of features moved there from the sprint backlog. If you wanted to put more effort into it, you could actually sort this by categories, by themes, etc., make it nicer, and then you could possibly use it as a product specification and as part of, say, the delivery to a customer. Which brings me to the end. Thank you very much, everyone. We are done with the initial part of what it means to be a product owner in Scrum, and we will follow up with more complex planning and tracking practices in the next slide deck. Thank you very much, and here we end.